In 1979, a woman was found after being murdered. 1 year later, a man found himself in court accused of the crime. After a trial, a jury found the man guilty of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. After serving 27 years behind bars, new DNA evidence arose which showed that the man doing time could not have committed the crime. The case was reopened, and an innocent man was exonerated. Now, when it comes to the free will case, in the minds of many it's closed. But what if the verdict handed down by ecclesiastical courts and ecclesiastical councils is the wrong verdict? What if we've come to the wrong conclusion? What if we reopen the case and re-examine our positions in light of the earliest church history? Now, when it comes to the free will controversy, most people think of Calvinism versus Arminianism. Those who are more knowledgeable of history think of Augustinianism versus Pelagianism. But very few people go beyond Augustine and look at the early church versus Gnosticism. In a day when Augustinian and Calvinistic theology has dominance, the position of free will is considered to be heretical. But in the days of the early church, it was orthodox to believe in free will, and it was considered heretical to deny it. One of the major differences between the early church and the Gnostics was their view of human nature. The early church believed that man had free will by nature and could choose between good and evil. The Gnostics, on the other hand, believed man was created with such a ruined constitution that he was forced to sin by necessity of his nature.
Zozam said that those ancient writers in general say that Manichaeans denied free will. The reason is that the fathers believed and maintained against the Manichaeans that whatever state man is in, he has the command over his own actions and has equally power to do good or evil. W. F. Hook said, "The Manichaeans so denied free will as to hold a fatal necessity of sinning." Lyman Beecher said, "The free will and natural ability of man were held by the whole church. Natural inability was to that of the pagan philosophers, the Gnostics, and the Manichaeans."
In the days of early Christianity, there were many Gnostic sects that denied the freedom of man's will. One of them was Marcionism, started by Marcion, but one of the greatest competitors to the early church was Manichaeanism, started by Mani, also known as Manes, who was a Persian philosopher. In the Acta Archelae, also known as the Disputation with Manes, the early church debated the founder of Manichaeanism. The early church chose Archelaus, who was a bishop in the early church, to represent their position, which was that God created us with free will. Mani, on the other hand, who was the founder of Manichaeanism, took the position that man's nature was so corrupt and so ruined that free will was not part of our constitution. At the end of the debate, the judges ruled in favor of Archelaus and stated that man does in fact have a free will, and ruled against Mani's position that our nature was so depraved and corrupted that liberty was not part of our constitution.
Archelaus said, "All the creatures that God made, he made very good, and he gave to every individual the sense of free will, by which standard he also instituted the law of judgment. Our will is constituted to choose either to sin or not to sin, and certainly whoever will may keep the commandments. Whoever despises them and turns aside to what is contrary to them shall yet without doubt have to face this law of judgment." The judges responded, "There can be no doubt that every individual, in using his own proper power of will, may shape his course in whatever direction he pleases."
The debate between Archelaus and Mani was at the core of the debate between the early church and Gnosticism. The church actually feared that Gnostic doctrine would infiltrate the church, and therefore this debate was of extreme importance. Gnostic doctrine was so dangerous, even in the times of the apostles, that the apostle John took up his pen against it in his epistles. 1 John says, "They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have no doubt continued with us, but they went out that they might be made manifest that they're not of us all." He also goes on to say, "And every spirit that confesses not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. and that the Spirit is an antichrist, whereof you have heard it is now should come, and even now already is in the world. He went on to say in 2 John, For many deceivers are entered into the world, who confess not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. The Gnostics were teaching that the flesh was in and of itself sinful, which is why they denied that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, and why the Bible called them deceivers and antichrists. In Gnosticism, sin was a substance of the body which is inherited at conception. But in the early church, sin was a choice of the will, which is originated by the individual. Now, the Bible actually came against this Gnostic view that sin was a substance of the body. But the Bible endorses the early church. For example, in Philippians 4:3, we read this, And I entreat thee also, true yokefellow, help those women which labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the others my fellow laborers, whose names are in the book of life. In Philippians, Paul mentioned his fellow laborers in the gospel, whose names were written in the book of life, and he specifically names Clement. Now, history knows this man, who was Paul's companion and was even endorsed by the scriptures themselves, as Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome taught the doctrine of free will.
Clement said that free will was given because he who is good by his own choice is really good, but he who is made good by another under necessity is not really good, because he is not what he is by his own choice. Clement said, It is therefore in the power of every one, since man has been made possessed of free will, whether he shall hear us to life, or the demons to destruction. Clement said, For no other reason does God punish the sinner, either in the present or in the future world, except because he knows that the sinner was able to conquer, but neglected to gain the victory.
Ignatius was another figure in the early church. He was a disciple of the Apostle John and was martyred in the Roman Colosseum. He was actually eaten by lions. In contradiction to Gnosticism, Ignatius said that men were sinners not by nature, but by free will.
Ignatius said, If anyone is truly religious, he is a man of God. But if he is irreligious, he is a man of the devil, made such not by nature, but by his own choice. Ignatius said, And there is set before us life upon our observance of God's precepts, but death as the result of disobedience, and everyone according to the choice he makes shall go to his own place. Let us flee from death and make choice of life.
The Apostle John also had a disciple named Polycarp. Polycarp was a personal friend of Ignatius and was also martyred in the Roman Colosseum. Polycarp had a faithful disciple named Irenaeus, and Irenaeus was also a teacher of free will.
Irenaeus said, Men are possessed with free will and endowed with the faculty of making a choice. It is not true, therefore, that some are by nature good and others bad. Irenaeus said, Man is endowed with the faculty of distinguishing good and evil, so that without compulsion he has the power by his own will and choice to perform God's commandments. Irenaeus said, Man is possessed of free will from the beginning, and God is possessed of free will in whom likeness man was created. Irenaeus said, This expression, How often would I have gathered thy children together, and thou wouldst not, set forth the ancient law of human liberty, because God made man a free agent from the beginning, possessing his own soul to obey the behests of God voluntarily, and not by the compulsion of God.
Justin Martyr was an early evangelist and apologist in the early church. He labored tirelessly for Christianity until he too was martyred in Rome. Justin taught that free will was an essential Christian doctrine.
We have learned from the prophets, and we hold it to be true, that punishment, chastisement, and rewards are rendered according to the merit of each man's actions. Otherwise, if all things happen by fate, then nothing is our own power. For if it is predestined that one man be good and another man evil, then the first is not deserving of praise, and the other to be blamed. Unless humans have the power of avoiding evil and choosing good by free choice, they are not accountable for their actions, whatever they may be. For neither would a man be worthy of praise if he did not himself choose the good, but was merely created for that end. Likewise, if a man were created evil, he would not deserve punishment, since he was not evil of himself, being unable to do anything else than what he was made for.
Tertullian was another leader in the early church. He was an apologist who was known for his prolific writings. He was in perfect agreement with the early church on his teachings on free will.
Tertullian said, "No reward can be justly bestowed. No punishment can be justly inflicted upon him who is good or bad by necessity, and not by his own choice." Tertullian said, "You will find that when he sets before man good and evil, life and death, that the entire course of discipline is arranged in precepts by God's calling men from sin, and threatening and exhorting them, and this on no other ground than that man is free with a will, either for obedience or resistance."
Methodius was another figure in the early church. He was actually a Christian martyr who lived in the end of the 3rd century. He wrote repeatedly on the topic of free will.
Methodius said, "Those pagans who decide that man does not have free will, but say that he is governed by the unavoidable necessities of fate, are guilty of impiety toward God himself, making him out to be the cause and author of human evils." Methodius said, "The divine being is not by nature implicated in evils. Therefore, our birth is not the cause of these things." He went on to say that men are possessing free will, and not by nature evil. Methodius said, "There is nothing evil by nature, but it is by use that evil things become such. So I say," says he, "that man was made with free will, not as if there were already evil in existence, which he had the power of choosing if he wished, but on account of his capacity of obeying or disobeying God. For this was the meaning of the gift of free will, and this alone is evil, namely disobedience." Methodius said, "God did not make evil, nor is he at all in any way the author of evil. But whatever failed to keep the law, which he in all justice ordained, after being made by him with a faculty of free will, for the purpose of guarding and keeping it, is called evil. Now it is the gravest fault to disobey God by overstepping the bounds of that righteousness which is consistent with free will."
Eusebius was a bishop in the early church. He's actually considered the father of church history for his extensive writing on the topics. Eusebius clearly laid out the position of early Christianity on the topic of free will.
"The Creator of all things has impressed a natural law upon the soul of every man as an assistant and ally in his conduct, pointing out to him the right way by this law, but by the free liberty with which he is endowed, making the choice of what is best worthy of praise and acceptance, because he has acted rightly, not by force, but from his own free will, when he had it in his power to act otherwise, as again making him who chooses what is worst, deserving of blame and punishment, as having by his own motion neglected the natural law, and becoming the origin and fountain of wickedness, and misusing himself, not from any extraneous necessity, but from free will and judgment. The fault is in him who chooses not in God, for God has not made nature or the substance of the soul bad. For he who is good can make nothing but what is good. Everything is good which is according to nature. Every rational soul has naturally a good free will, formed for the choice of what is good. But when a man acts wrongly, nature is not to be blamed, for what is wrong takes place not according to nature, but contrary to nature, it being the work of choice and not of nature. The devil in his oracles hangs all things upon fate, and taking away that which is in our power, and arises from self-motion of free will, brings this also into bondage to necessity.
The early church, before Augustine, taught that free will was a faculty of our God-given nature, and that we abuse that faculty when we choose to sin. They said that all men are of the same nature, in the sense that free will was in the faculties of all men.
Irenaeus said, "Forasmuch as all men are of the same nature, having power to hold and to do that which is good, and having power again to lose it, and not to do what is right before men of sense, and how much more before God, some are justly accused, and receive condign punishment because they refuse what is just and right." Irenaeus said, "Those who do not do it good will receive the just judgment of God, because they had not worked good when they had it in their power to do so. But if some had been made by nature bad, and others good, these latter would not be deserving of praise for being good, for they were created that way. Nor would the former be reprehensible, for that is how they were made. However, all men are of the same nature. They are all able to hold fast and do what is good. On the other hand, they have the power to cast good from them, and not to do it. Pelagius said, "In all there is free will equally by nature." Origen said, "The Scriptures emphasize the freedom of will. They condemn those who sin and approve those who do right. We are responsible for being bad and worthy of being cast outside, for it is not the nature in us that is the cause of the evil. Rather, it is the voluntary choice that works evil." Origen said, "The heretics, the Gnostics, introduced the doctrine of different natures."
There are two conflicting views of human nature in the days of the early church. The early Christians believed that free will was in the nature of all men. Some men used that freedom to be good, some men used that freedom to be evil, but they viewed that the moral character of man was altogether voluntary. The Gnostics, on the other hand, believed that mankind had such ruined and corrupt natures that they were not free to choose between good and evil. They viewed the actions and behaviors of men as being necessitated and caused by their natures, and therefore they viewed the moral character of man as to be sort of involuntary, not truly their fault, but a fault in their design. The early Christians taught that it's not that men are good or evil by nature, that good men have a nature that forces them to do good, or that evil men have evil natures that force them to do evil, but that all men have the same nature and all men have free will. Some men use that free will to be good, some men use that free will to be evil. Anyone who actually takes the time to study the writings of the early church and is willing to look beyond Augustine will see that free will was the universal and orthodox position of all of the early Christians. Anyone who takes the time to study the early church and will actually look beyond Augustine will see that free will was universally the orthodox Christian doctrine. For example, John Calvin, who didn't hold to the doctrine of free will, admitted this fact. John Calvin said this, "As to the fathers, if their authority weighs with us, they have the term free will constantly in their mouths." He also said, "The Greek fathers above others have taught the power of the human will, and they have not been ashamed to make use of a much more arrogant expression, calling man free agent or self-manager, just as if man had the power to govern himself." Calvin also recognized that the Latin fathers have always retained the word free will as if man yet stood upright.
Episcopius said, "What is plainer than that the ancient divines, for 300 years after Christ, those at least who flourished before St. Augustine, maintained the liberty of our will, or an indifference of two contrary things, free from all internal and external necessity?" Walter Arthur Coppinger said, "All the fathers are unanimous on the freedom of the human will." Lyman Beecher said, "The free will and natural ability of man were held by the whole Church." Dr. Wigger said, "All the fathers agreed with the Pelagians in attributing freedom of will to man in his present state."
This last quote is extremely important because today, whenever a person believes in free will, or that man has the natural ability to obey God or not, he's almost immediately accused by Calvinists of being a heretical Pelagian. But this accusation is truly being unfair to the free will position, because all of the early church before Augustine believed that man had a free will. And this was before Pelagius even existed. The Pelagians believed in the doctrine of free will, but that doesn't mean everyone who believes in the doctrine of free will is a Pelagian. In fact, such reasoning is truly fallacious. For example, the Catholics believe in the virgin birth, but that doesn't mean everyone who believes in the virgin birth is a Catholic, because the virgin birth is not exclusively a Catholic doctrine. Likewise, free will is not exclusively a Pelagian doctrine. Therefore, not everyone who believes in free will is a Pelagian.
Williston Walker said that even in Pelagius' own day, Pelagius' teaching on the freedom of the human will was in agreement with many in the West and with the East generally. Asa Mahan said, "Free will was the doctrine of the primitive church for the first 4 or 5 centuries after the Bible was written, the church which received the lively oracles directly from the hands of some of those whom they were written, to wit, the writers of the New Testament." It should be borne in mind here that at the time the sacred canon was completed, the doctrine of necessity was held by the leading sects in the Jewish church. It was also the fundamental article of the creed of all the sects in philosophy throughout the world, as well as of all the forms of heathenism then extant. If the doctrine of necessity, as its advocates maintain, is the doctrine taught the Church by inspired apostles and the writers of the New Testament, we should not fail to find under such circumstances the churches planted by them, rooted and grounded in this doctrine. David Berso said, "The early Christians didn't believe that man is totally depraved and incapable of doing any good. They taught that humans are capable of obeying and loving God." There was a religious group labeled as heretics by the early Christians. They taught that man is totally depraved. The group I'm referring to are the Gnostics.
When reading the writings of the early church, you would think by these quotes that they were debating Calvinists and that they were refuting Calvinism. But it was actually the Gnostics that they were coming against. It was Gnosticism that they were refuting. It should cause no small stir to those who hold to the inability of man, that they can't find any support for their doctrine from the early church, but they only have the Gnostics who agree with them. The errors of the Gnostics were continually rejected by the early church, but the Gnostics continued to try to infiltrate the church with their doctrine. The Gnostics even wrote their own Gospels, known as the Gnostic Gospels, where they stole credible names like Mary or Thomas to try and give validity to their teachings. And while the church today seems to reject Gnosticism as a whole, the Gnostic view of human nature and the Gnostic view of sin seems to have found wide acceptance today, while the view of the early church is seldom held to or taught. Next, we're going to look at how the early church ended up departing from its earlier views. If all of the early Christians believed in free will, what went wrong? When did this change and who changed it? If the church was perfectly united for hundreds of years on this point, who caused this division? These are very important questions that few seem to consider, yet the answer in history is obvious enough. It was not until the 4th century that Gnostic and Manichaean doctrine began to influence the church. Augustine, after saturating himself in Gnostic philosophy for nearly a decade, was converted to the church and he was appointed as a bishop. Augustine, once he was in the church, began to contradict what the fathers had always taught about free will, and he taught views that were in accordance with the Gnostic doctrines. And it was under Augustine's influence that the church began to embrace the doctrine of the natural inability of man. Now, it is an undisputed and known fact of history that Augustine was influenced by Gnosticism and was a member of Manichaeanism. In fact, this is a point admitted by his biographers and admirers.
John K. Ryan, in his introduction to The Confessions of St. Augustine, said, "The two great intellectual influences upon Augustine prior to his conversion were Manichaeism and Greek philosophy." In their introduction to the Confessions of Augustine, John Gibb and William Montgomery said, "In the same year in which he read the Scriptures and was disappointed in them, Augustine joined the Manichaean sect. For nearly 9 years, Augustine was a Manichaean auditor. At first, he was a zealous partisan who contended publicly for his new faith and did not hesitate to ridicule the doctrines of the Church, and especially the Old Testament Scriptures."
The founder of Manichaeanism was Manes, also known as Mani, whom we saw Archelaus of the early church debated against. Augustine was a Manichaean for many years, and he personally studied the writings of Mani. Surprisingly, when Augustine first converted to the church, he began to defend free will when debating against the Manichaeans. That's why quotes from Augustine can be found from his earlier writings in which he defended the freedom of man's will.
Augustine said, We Christians assert the liberty of the will, whereby our actions are rendered either moral or immoral, and keep it free from every bond of necessity, on account of the righteous judgment of God.
After refuting the Manichaeans and defending free will, when Augustine was debating the Pelagians on theological issues, he went back to the doctrine of the natural inability of man, just as the Manichaeans had taught, and just as he had formerly believed as a Gnostic.
Augustine said, "I have tried hard to maintain the free choice of the human will, but the grace of God prevailed." Bosob said, Augustine defended free will so long as he had to do with the Manichaeans. But when he came to dispute with the Pelagians, he changed his system. Then he denied that kind of freedom which before he had defended. And so far as I am able to judge, his sentiments no longer differed from theirs, the Manichaeans, concerning the servitude of the will. He ascribed the servitude to the corruption which original sin brought into our nature, whereas the Manichaeans ascribed it to an evil quality eternally inherent in matter. Charles Finney said, "This doctrine is a stumbling block both to the Church and the world, infinitely dishonorable to God, and an abomination alike to God and the human intellect, and should be banished from every pulpit and from every formula of doctrine and from the world. It is a relic of heathen philosophy, and was foisted in among the doctrines of Christianity by Augustine, as everyone may know who will take the trouble to examine for himself." Harry Kahn said that Augustine, after studying the philosophy of Manes, the Persian philosopher, brought into the Church from Manichaeism the doctrine of original sin.
The corruption of our nature, or the loss of our free will, Augustine credited to the original sin of Adam.
Augustine said, "Free choice of the will was present in that man who was the first to be formed. But after he sinned by that free will, we who have descended from his progeny have been plunged into necessity." Augustine said, "By Adam's transgression, the freedom of the human will has been completely lost." Augustine said, "By the greatness of the first sin, we have lost the free will to love God." Augustine said, "By subverting the rectitude in which he was created, he is followed with a punishment of not being able to do right." Augustine said, "The freedom to abstain from sin has been lost as a punishment of sin."
A simple reading of Genesis, specifically the narrative of the original sin of Adam, reveals that the Bible nowhere states that free will was lost because of his sin. In fact, in all of the consequences that God declared because of their sin, the loss of their free will, or that of their descendants, is not mentioned or even hinted at. Rather, after the fall of Adam and Eve, God continued to speak to men as if they were free moral agents with the power of self-determination. For example, in Genesis, we read God speaking to Cain as a free moral agent. We read this, "And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shall thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lies at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him." There are many other scriptures in which God speaks to men after the fall of Adam as free moral agents possessing the power of self-determination.
"Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. A blessing if ye obey the commandments of the Lord your God, and a curse if ye will not obey the commandments of the Lord your God." Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 26 to 28. "Choose you this day whom ye will serve." Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. "Behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death." Jeremiah chapter 21, verse 8. "Repent and turn yourselves from all your transgressions, so iniquity shall not be your ruin. Cast away from you all your transgressions, whereby ye have transgressed, and make you a new heart and a new spirit, for why will ye die?" Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 30 to 31. "God commandeth all men everywhere to repent." Acts chapter 17, verse 30.
In light of scriptures like these, many students of the Bible have recognized the fact that free will, or the power of self-determination, actually survived Adam's misuse.
Adam Clarke commented on Deuteronomy chapter 11 verse 26 and said, "If God had not put it in the power of this people either to obey or disobey, if they had not had a free will over which they had complete authority to use it either in the way of willing or nilling, could God, with any propriety, have given such precepts as these, sanctioned with such promises and threatenings? If they were not free agents, they could not be punished for disobedience, nor could they, in any sense of the word, have been rewardable for obedience." Irenaeus said, "God has always preserved freedom and the power of self-government in man. Man is possessed of free will from the beginning." Origen said, "The faculty of free will is never taken away." Cornelius Van Til said, "Sin did not take away from man any of the natural powers that God had given him." Dr. Twist said, "No faculty of our nature is taken away from us by original sin." Pelagius said, "We have first of all to discuss the position which is maintained that our nature has been weakened and changed by sin. I think that before all other things, we have to inquire what sin is. Some substance, or wholly a name without substance, whereby is expressed not a thing, not an existence, not some sort of a body, but the doing of a wrongful deed. I suppose that this is the case, and if so, how could that which lacks all substance have possibly weakened or changed human nature? No will can take away that which is proved to be inseparably implanted in nature." Julian of Eclanum said, "Free will is an all by nature, and could not perish by the sin of Adam, which assertion is confirmed by the authority of all Scriptures." Julian of Eclanum said, "Free will has not perished, since the Lord says by the prophets, 'If you be willing and will hear me, you shall eat the good things of the land. If you are unwilling and will not hear, the sword shall devour you.'"
If Augustine did not learn from the scriptures that free will was lost as a result of Adam's sin, where did his novel notion come from? Understanding Augustine's background as a Manichaean, it's easy to understand how Augustine believed man had a ruined and corrupted nature without the freedom to choose between good and evil. There were a total of 19 bishops within the church, including Julian of Eclanum, who opposed Augustine's teaching that free will had been lost. These bishops must have thought to themselves, "Who is this Bishop Augustine that denies free will? The early church fathers always held to the freedom of man's nature. Oh, Augustine used to be a Gnostic? He was a Manichaean? Well, that explains it."
Julian of Eclanum stated Augustine's position. By the sin of the first man, that is, of Adam, free will perished, and that no one has now the power of living well, but that all are constrained into sin by the necessity of their flesh. Reverend Daniel R. Jennings said, "Julian sensed a carryover of Manichaean thought from Augustine into the Christian church. This is why Julian referred to the Augustinians as those Manichaeans." George Predeman said, "Augustine was in the early part of his life a Manichaean, but some remains of it seem to have been still left upon his mind."
By teaching that man did not possess free will, and that sin was therefore a result of a defect within man's nature, Augustine was actually bringing into the church Gnostic concepts and doctrines. Sin was no longer viewed as a purely ethical problem, or a problem of how man uses his faculty of will, but sin became a problem of metaphysics, a fault in the faculty of the will itself. Those laymen and bishops who stood up against Augustine's view that free will had been lost, who accused Augustine of teaching Manichaeanism, who continued to teach the old truths of Christianity, what the early church had always taught, were condemned as heretics and labeled as Pelagians, once Augustinian theology had dominance. Those many bishops who taught that free will was not lost by the original sin of Adam, and who continued to teach that men were sinful not by constitution, but by choice, were ripped out of their pulpits, had their material possessions confiscated, and were excommunicated by both state and church. The doctrine of the early church, or the doctrine of free will, was soon replaced with the Gnostic concept of a necessitated will because of a ruined, corrupted, sinful nature. Augustinian theology was a radical departure from the views of the early church, and like Calvinism after it, Augustinianism used governmental force to silence any opposition so that its views could spread without challenge. There are subtle differences and yet major similarities between Augustinianism and full-blown Gnosticism. The Gnostics, for example, taught that man's nature was ruined and corrupt because man was created by an inferior god known as the demiurge. Augustine, on the other hand, agreed with the Gnostics that man's nature was so corrupt that we didn't have a free will, yet he said God made it this way on account of Adam's sin. And the Gnostics taught that the flesh was sinful in and of itself, therefore Jesus Christ did not have a flesh. Augustine, on the other hand, taught that the flesh, because of its desires, was sinful, and that this sin is transmitted from parent to child through the sexual passions of intercourse, yet Jesus, because he was born of a virgin, was born without this hereditary sin. Therefore, Augustine agreed with the Gnostics in principle, but he differed from them in explanation. So Augustinian theology is really a modified Manichaeanism or a semi-Gnosticism. Let's consider the following facts. All of the early Christians before Augustine believed in man's free will and denied the doctrine of natural inability. The Gnostics, in the days of the early church, believed in man's natural inability and denied the doctrine of free will. Augustine was a Gnostic for nearly a decade in the Manichaean sect, and he converted to the church out of Gnosticism. After joining the church and being appointed a bishop, Augustine began to deny the doctrine of free will and to teach the natural inability of man. And the church, under Augustine's influence, began to believe in the doctrine of natural inability, which it never before held to, and which, prior to Augustine, they would argue against. What can we conclude from these facts, except that when Augustine converted to the church out of Gnosticism, he brought with him some Gnostic doctrines. His views regarding human nature and free will was not held at all by the early Christians, but was held by the Gnostics. Clearly, Augustine departed from the views of the early Christians and remained in agreement with Gnosticism. Augustinian theology has tainted Christian doctrine, so that we have been influenced by Gnostic views. The church seems to have gone wrong at the time of Augustine, and that church history after him has been affected. So next, we're going to look at how other influential church leaders have been influenced by Augustine's teachings and continued to propagate those ideas. On August 9, 1173, construction began on a tower in Italy. By the time the construction progressed to the third floor, the tower began to lean. The problem was that the foundation underneath the structure was not solid, and because the foundation was not solid, the entire structure was affected. The builders continued to build upon this faulty foundation, and that's why this tower has been forever branded as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. In church history, Christian theology began to lean off course around the time of the 5th century. Augustinian doctrine became foundational in theology. The conclusions that Augustine came to became the premises of theologians after him. And building upon that foundation, the direction of church history has been forever affected. Augustine actually taught many false doctrines, such as praying to the dead or persecuting heretics, infant damnation, the transmission of sin, infant baptism, baptismal regeneration. And while Augustine's views were not adopted by all the groups within Christendom, such as the Anabaptist or the Eastern Orthodox churches, it was Augustine's view regarding human nature and free will that went beyond the Catholic Church into the Protestant realm. The greatest contributors to modern theology have been Augustine, Luther, and Calvin. The mind of Augustine was influenced by Manichaean thought, and the minds of Luther and Calvin were influenced by Augustinian thought. Therefore, it's no surprise to see that Augustine denied free will just as the Manichaeans did, and Luther and Calvin denied free will just as Augustine did. The Manichaeans influenced Augustine, and Augustine influenced Luther and Calvin. There's no dispute over the fact that Augustine influenced Luther and Calvin. Luther was even an Augustinian monk, and the biographers of Luther and Calvin admit the fact that Augustinian doctrine was influential upon their minds.
William Carlos Martin said about Luther, "The study of the Bible and of Augustine theology led him to the Redeemer." Johann Heinrich Kurtz said, "Luther zealously studied the Bible along with the writings of Augustine." Thomas H. Dyer said in his biography of John Calvin, "The doctrine of predestination, which is generally regarded as that of which principally characterizes Calvin, is in fact that of St. Augustine." Oliver Joseph Thatcher said, "In theology, he, Calvin, was a close follower of St. Augustine. His influence was to revivify the ideas of St. Augustine and joining them to the main ideas of the Reformation, embody them in the church he organized." The Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics said, "Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, with minor divergences, agree in the reverting to St. Augustine on the main issues, and in the supposed interests of evangelical piety."
Luther actually referred to Augustine 13 times in his book, The Bondage of the Will, and in the works of Martin Luther, Augustine is referred to 24 times. In the Institutes of Christian Religion by John Calvin, Augustine is referenced 265 times. Since Luther and Calvin were both students of Augustine and basically learned their theology from him, it's not surprising to find the remnants of Gnostic and Manichaean views in their theological writings.
Martin Luther said, "Man has lost his freedom and is forced to serve sin and cannot will good. He sins and wills evil necessarily." Luther also stated, "Sin is his nature, and of himself he can do nothing but sin."
In his Institutes, John Calvin said that man does not have a free will in the sense of a free choice between good and evil, but he actually denied this altogether.
Calvin paraphrases Augustine saying, "Nature began to want liberty the moment the will was vanquished by the revolt into which it fell. By making a bad use of free will, lost both himself and his will. Free will, having been made a captive, can do nothing in the way of righteousness. Man at his creation received a great degree of free will, but lost it by sinning." The Christian Spectator said, "Augustine and Calvin and all of the Reformers taught the bondage or moral impotence of the will."
While the early church wrote about the freedom of the will, Martin Luther wrote a whole book called The Bondage of the Will. This shows a clear and radical departure from early Christianity.
Charles Party said, in his teaching on total depravity and bondage of the will, Calvin is essentially following Augustine and Luther and not creating a so-called Calvinistic doctrine.
Luther actually defended his position against free will by saying Augustine is wholly on my side. And John Calvin tried to dismiss the charge of being opposed to the early church by saying Augustine hesitated not to call the will a slave. He also said, lest he be charged with being opposed to all antiquity, let us hear Augustine in his own words. While Calvin tried to say that he was not opposed to all antiquity when it came to free will, what he meant was that he was not opposed to Augustine, because Augustine was the only exception. Calvin was opposed to all of the early church fathers except for Augustine when it came to the issue of free will.
John Calvin said, "All ancient theologians, with the exception of Augustine, are so confused, vacillating, and contradictory on this subject that no certainty can be obtained from their writings." Calvin admitted, "It may perhaps seem that I have greatly prejudiced my own view by confessing that all the ecclesiastical writers, with the exception of Augustine, have spoken too ambiguously or inconsistently on this subject that no certainty is attainable from their writings."
The reason that John Calvin rejected all ancient theologians and dismissed their writings on free will, except for Augustine, is because all ancient theologians taught the freedom of the will, except for Augustine.
Gregory Boyd said, This in part explains why Calvin cannot cite ante-Nicene fathers against his libertarian opponents. Hence, when Calvin debates Pigouis on the freedom of the will, he cites Augustine abundantly, but no early church fathers are cited. George Predeman said, "The peculiar tenets of Calvinism are in direct opposition to the doctrines maintained in the primitive Church of Christ." George Predeman said, "There is a great similarity between the Calvinistic system and the earliest heresies."
The Reformers sought to return the church to early Christianity, but they actually brought it back to earlier heresies because they didn't go beyond Augustine. They didn't go far back enough. Rather than returning the church to early Christianity, they actually resurrected Augustinian Gnostic doctrine.
The Methodist Quarterly Review said, "At the Reformation, Augustinianism received an emphatic reinforcement among the Protestant churches." The Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics said, "It is Augustine who gave us the Reformation." For the Reformation, inwardly considered, was just the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine. The Reformation came, seeing that it was on its theological side, a revival of Augustinianism.
The Reformation was to a great extent a revival or resurrection of Augustinian doctrine and a further departure from early Christianity. Gnosticism, Augustinianism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, they all have a lot in common. Augustinianism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism all teach Gnostic views of human nature and free will, but under a different name. It's the same old Gnosticism, but in a new wrapper. While other doctrines also seem to have originated within Gnosticism, no doctrine has spread so widely and with so much acceptance as the doctrine of man's natural inability to obey God. This doctrine has been taught by both Catholics and Protestants, by both Arminians and Calvinists. Consider the following facts that we have shown. Augustine's mind was greatly influenced by Manichaean thought on the topic of free will and human nature, and he clearly departed from the views of the early church. The minds of Luther and Calvin were highly influenced by Augustinian thought, and they admitted to departing from the views of the early church. And Augustine, Luther, and Calvin are undeniably the greatest contributors to Christian theology. Isn't it abundantly clear that Gnosticism or Manichaeanism has come into the church and has permeated it with its views? The Gnostic doctrine of the natural inability of man, or the bondage of the will, has crept into the church through a Trojan horse and has been masquerading as Christianity ever since. Gnostic views regarding human nature and free will have survived the centuries because Augustinianism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism have preserved it and promoted it. And while the doctrine of the natural inability of man has spread like a plague, finding acceptance in many churches, it's not taught in the Bible, and it's not found in the earliest writings of Christianity. We've covered a lot of ground, so in closing, let's briefly summarize what we've learned. First, we saw that the Gnostics denied the freedom of man's will and taught that man was under a necessity to sin.
W. F. Hook said, "The Manichaeans so denied free will as to hold a fatal necessity of sinning." Lyman Beecher said, "The free will and natural ability of man were held by the whole church. Natural inability was to that of the pagan philosophers, the Gnostics, and the Manichaeans."
We also learned that all of the early Christians before Augustine believed in the freedom of man's will, and that man had a choice between obedience and disobedience.
Episcopius said, "What is plainer than that the ancient divines, for 300 years after Christ, those at least who flourished before St. Augustine, maintained the liberty of our will, or an indifference of two contrary things, free from all internal and external necessity?" Dr. Wigger said, "All the fathers agreed with the Pelagians in attributing freedom of will to man in his present state."
We showed that Augustine was a Manichaean for 9 years and was even a member of their Gnostic sect.
John K. Ryan, in his introduction to The Confessions of St. Augustine, said, The two great intellectual influences upon Augustine prior to his conversion were Manichaeism and Greek philosophy. In their introduction to the Confessions of Augustine, John Gibb and William Montgomery said, in the same year in which he read the Scriptures and was disappointed in them, Augustine joined the Manichaean sect. For nearly 9 years, Augustine was a Manichaean auditor.
We observe that Augustine, after joining the church, began to teach that men do not have free will, but are under a necessity to sin.
Augustine said, free choice of the will was present in that man who was the first to be formed. But after he sinned by that free will, we who have descended from his progeny have been plunged into necessity. Augustine said, by Adam's transgression, the freedom of the human will has been completely lost.
We also saw that Augustine had a major influence upon Martin Luther and John Calvin.
Johann Heinrich Kurtz said, Luther zealously studied the Bible along with the writings of Augustine. Oliver Joseph Thatcher said, in theology, he, Calvin, was a close follower of St. Augustine. His influence was to revivify the ideas of St. Augustine and joining them to the main ideas of the Reformation, embody them in the church he organized.
And lastly, we saw that the Reformation was a revival of Augustinian doctrine, so that Luther, Calvin, and other reformers denied the freedom of man's will, and the doctrine of man's natural inability became a doctrine of Reformed theology.
The Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics said, it is Augustine who gave us the Reformation. For the Reformation, inwardly considered, was just the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine. The Reformation came, seeing that it was on its theological side, a revival of Augustinianism. The Christian Spectator said, Augustine and Calvin and all of the reformers taught the bondage or moral impotence of the will.
It doesn't take much to connect the historical dots to see the evident fact that Augustine brought Manichaean views into the church, and these Manichaean views were further propagated by Luther, Calvin, and other reformers. These are not unfounded accusations, but should be recognized as blatantly obvious facts. It is a historical fact that the doctrine of man's natural inability did not originate in early Christianity, but originated in Gnosticism. The early Christians did not believe in the natural inability of man, because it was not a doctrine taught to them by the apostles. The doctrine of free will is the orthodox historical doctrine of Christianity, while the doctrine of man's natural inability is historically heretical. And that's why it's time that we move beyond Augustine and return once again to the faith that was delivered unto the saints.
The material in this video was taken from The Natural Ability of Man, a study on free will and human nature, written by Jesse Morell. The Natural Ability of Man is a thorough defense and explanation of the Christian doctrine of free will. To order a copy, visit www.openairoutreach.com.